So today we have Emily Corey from Corey Nutrition. And Corey Nutrition, basically, they make the product Inukshook. And we're gonna pick her brain because this is what she does, and learn about the food, learn about food in general, learn about what dogs need to sustain a proper health, and then when you're running. And we've actually pulled up some pretty good statistics on calories that dog burn, the caloric cup, how much is in a cup. So this is very interesting to me. So we're going to dive in and pick Emily's brain and see what she can teach us or help us learn to help maintain our dogs better. Emily, how is everything up in New Brunswick today?
Things are great, Heath. It's finally starting to cool down a little bit here, so it's feeling a little bit more like Christmas.
Cool down? Is it hot? Has it been hot?
Well, no, but we've had an unusually warm fall here, so it's been up around 70 for up until November, which is late for here, and then it dropped down below freezing, and we really haven't looked back, so it's been a bit of an adjustment period. Yeah,
it was like that here a little bit. The last week it was in the mid 40s to mid 50s most of the week. This week, today, it's been a little cooler. We're supposed to be getting some sleet and freezing rain coming in tomorrow night and Thursday. So I like it in that 35 to 45 range. That's kind of especially when I'm hunting. I don't like it when I've got to walk around in a t-shirt. It doesn't feel normal.
Yeah.
So Emily, I know I've picked your brain, and I want to learn, and I think this would just go across the board for most dog foods. But tell us a little bit about Inukshook and the symbol, which I know what it is because I've researched it, and I know what it is. But tell us about the symbol first. How did you come up with that?
Yeah. So. Our company's been around since 1982. Our roots themselves are in making feed for the aquaculture industry. So we're right on the East Coast in Eastern Canada. We started making food for salmon farms is where we started back in the 80s. Mm-hmm. When we started dabbling in dog food, really what happened is we had a guy that was coming in here from a central part of the province where there's no real water around. We knew he didn't have fish, but he was buying a metric ton of fish food at a time. And after the third or fourth time he did this in the wintertime, when fish really aren't eating either, we asked him, what are you doing with this stuff? And what he said was, I'm feeding it to my dogs. Feeding it to your dogs? He's like, yeah, I've got a sled dog team, and I can't find a food out there that has enough energy in it in order to be able to sustain them when they're running in the cold. So I've been feeding them this fish food. And we kind of looked at him and was like, well, we can make you something better than that. And really that's where it started. So we're Inukshook professional dog food. That symbology, that little stone man, mm-hmm. comes from the north in northern Canada. And what it symbolizes is when sled dog teams were running, when people were moving from community to community, and it's the sky is white, the ground's white, there's no real landmarks because there's no trees, people would build these stone men to point the direction in between towns and on routes and where to go. Plus, they would use them as caches, as food caches. So there'd be food or sweaters, stuff stored underneath these uh-huh. stone men for people that were traveling through the community. And since we were developing a food specifically for sled dogs at that time, that was what we felt to be a very great northern symbol of what this food would represent.
Oh, like I said, I had researched it and knew a little bit. You give me a little bit more information, but that's pretty neat that, everything has a meaning behind it. Mm-hmm. So
it really does.
Yeah. So, Emily, go ahead and just, tell us, I know the brands that you have, and you've just recently entered up, or y'all have put the marine in with the fish-based proteins. Just kind of give us a rundown of the dog foods, and then we'll get into puppy nutrition, raising the pup, what the pup needs, and then we're going to get into kind of some meat and potatoes of what you guys have built and why you built it.
Yep. So we have 5 formulas within the Inukshook line. Mm-hmm. There's 3 that we call the original, and you'll notice the numbers. There's 2 numbers in each of the names, and what they represent is the protein level and the fat level. So we have a 26-16, we call it, but that's 26% protein, 16% fat. A 30-25, so 30% protein, 25% fat, and then a 32-32, which is the 32% protein and 32% fat, which is the highest energy dog food that exists on the marketplace. We just recently, in the last year and a half, launched kind of a parallel line to go alongside it, and we're calling those Marine 16 and Marine 25. But they are a 26-16 formula, but with all fish protein and slightly different carbohydrate base. And same, like a 30-25 formula, so Marine 25, with that same fish and slightly different carbohydrate base than the originals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm running, well, I pretty much maintain 30-25 throughout the year, and then I had bought a pallet of the 32-32 last year, and I had some left over, so I'm actually feeding that to 6 of my dogs right now. But when you talk about the different proteins, so you use chicken basically in the 30 and the 32, and then you have the fish in the 25 and the 16.
Yeah, so we've got the original line, the proteins in all 3 of the formulas are chicken and herring. Mm-hmm. And then in the marine line, it's a herring, whitefish, and salmon blend.
Yeah. So let's get into, like, one of the things that throws people off on some of your ingredients that I hear them say, that's the first thing they say is, oh, it's got corn in it. It's got corn in it. And yes, we know that corn is a sugar and it turns into carbohydrates. So tell us, it really don't matter why, because the proof's kind of in the pudding, but tell us a little bit about the corn and what it's doing and what you've added it into there for.
Yeah, so the reason that we use corn in our diet is, well, there's a multitude of them. One, we use it because when finely ground, which is what we do here, we grind things down to the consistency of flour, and cooked, it is a highly digestible carbohydrate source. Now, carbohydrates themselves are important to dog diets when you're talking about performance and getting energy levels and getting things going. Not as important as fat, but it is an important source of carbohydrates in the diet. They do need carbohydrates in some capacity. Now, we use corn because it is so highly digestible. It's also very highly researched. It's been on the market for really quite some time, and due to that fact, we know a lot about it. We know how the dogs can use it. We know that in terms of digestibility, it's quite high. Glycemic index, it's a moderate, so it works there. It doesn't spike the sugar level in the dog's blood. But it is a good, solid, well-researched carbohydrate source that isn't too expensive, which is also important when you're talking about formulating dog foods. That's really why we use it. There's other options, there's other things that you can use, but we like to stick to things. Our philosophy here is what's known and what's well-researched and what can be justified. The reason that I think it's got such a bad, or sometimes a negative, stereotype in the marketplace is because it has been historically used and abused. So if it's not that finely ground and you can kind of see chunks of it in the food, it's not going to be digested as well as if it is finely ground. If it's overused and it's, you've got it in your first ingredient or your first couple ingredients, you have a lot of carbohydrates in your diet, and that might not be what you're actually looking for in a working dog diet. And probably not as what is optimal. And you can also get a protein source out of it called corn gluten, which can boost your protein numbers, but it's coming from that particular source rather than from animal sources. So over the years, it's kind of gotten a bad reputation as a carbohydrate source. But when used properly, it is a really good one, and a really one that we can really stand behind.
Yeah. Like I said, I definitely. Like I said, what got me using your product is I have some good friends in New York, upstate New York, and Harris's daughter, she runs the Iditarod. She lives in Alaska, and she actually took over some of Arlie Reynolds' dogs. I don't know if you know who Arlie is, but she took over some of his dogs, and she runs them. And Harris said, because, I was feeding Purina at the time, and he was like, Heath, you really ought to look into the Inukshook. And I'm like, well, I don't even know what it is. So we got to looking at it, and he was telling me, and I mean, this was back in 2013 or 14 is when I first tried it, because the guys up there would go to Bangor and pick it up there. So I would always get them to they would get me 8 or 10 bags, and they feed the 2616. That's what they run. So I had fed quite a bit of that at the time, and just because of shipping and everything else, it just didn't work out. But the more I looked at it, and I realized that a lot of these guys that was running sled dogs are using that product, and I'm like, man, I mean, if they're running sled dogs with this stuff, it's got to be decent. It's got to be good, and I just got to make a better effort to try and get it. So that's kind of what led me into your product. And we know that there's a lot of good foods out there, and people have their own preferences, but it's really worked for me. And one thing that I do like, of course, I do buy bulk, but it's a one time a year thing most of the time, or a year and a little bit more. And it works good for me. Mm-hmm. So you went through your 2616, your 30-25, 32-32, and then your Marine 16 and 25. And there's nothing that really stands out and says puppy formula. You know how everybody else has their puppy brand and puppy chow and puppy this and puppy that. So tell us what you guys have lined up and the practice, or what you do for puppies if you're feeding puppies this food. So
when it comes to our diet specifically, what we always recommend is puppies are fed the 2616 or the Marine 16 until about a year old. Now, the way that our diets are designed are based on activity level. The thing about the way the pet food industry works is on the back of your every pet food bag that you will go see, there should be what is called an AFCO statement. And that statement in and of itself will tell you a lot about how that food is formulated. So if it says formulated for all life stages, it is formulated for puppies, adults, and can be fed to seniors all the way through life. And all puppy foods are all life stage diets. Now, in the last few years, they put in a new requirement for large breed dogs to specify whether or not this particular diet is suitable for large breed dogs over, I think it's 70 pounds is the cutoff. And that has to do with different nutrient requirements for those large and giant breed dogs. But if you look at that statement, you could, no matter how it's marketed, it may be marketed as a puppy food or it may not be marketed as a puppy food, but that statement will tell you whether or not it is actually suitable for growing dogs. Since we designed our diets more along the energy levels of what is required for different types of activities, so as we've been talking about sled dogs, the 32-32 highest energy dog food in the market with 32% fat, that's specifically designed for sled dogs that are pulling all day long for oftentimes many days on end, but it works really well for skinny dogs as well that can't keep weight or are still really quite active, not necessarily a sled dog. That's the highest energy. One step down from that is the 30-25, and that's really designed for, it is also an all life stage diet. We recommend you start feeding it at about a year because most dogs don't require that energy level until they're actually out and working and performing. Mm-hmm. But it is designed for that purpose. It's designed for those mid-range activity levels, dogs that might not be doing an Iditarod, but they're out and they're working most days, have a hard time keeping weight on a general adult maintenance diet, or just require a little bit more to get going. So your hunt dogs, your search and rescue dogs, dogs that kind of fall into that mid-range category. The 2616 itself is designed as an as an all life stage diet, but it can be more used for off season as well as puppies, and is also suitable for your sprint dogs. So your dogs that are doing great, like greyhounds for racing and stuff like that. So as much as we've designed our family of formulas to be around energy level, they are also suitable for different life stages. Yeah, are you catching what I'm putting down there, Heath?
Oh, yeah. No, I'm sitting here. I'm just taking it in. But I have my puppies, they prefer, of course, like I said, I don't have the 2616. I have the 3025 and 3232. But my pups prefer just to eat the 32 or the 3025.
Yeah, and that's fine. We don't recommend that to Joe Public, just out of cautious, being cautious, but professionals. It is absolutely suitable for that life stage, and you're more than welcome to do that.
Yeah. So feed in while we're on the lines of pups before we move into something else. So feeding them the 30-25, that doesn't cause them to grow too fast or stunt their growth by being of course the protein is 30%. We know that helps their joints and, cartilage and tendons and everything else along the lines. And the fat content, now I don't feed the pups quite as much. I have learned to adjust accordingly. But you don't see any downfall from doing that. No. Yeah.
One of the biggest thing you're looking for growing puppies, especially when you get into the larger dogs, is your calcium and your phosphorus. When you see issues, and really what the AFCO statements are built around are cutoffs in calcium in particular. When the calcium and phosphorus levels are too high for large breed dogs, you can start to get into those issues with hip dysplasia and other skeletal issues with the skeleton. And that is really the biggest driver there. The thing about the 30-25 is that it's still built. The calcium levels and everything are completely accessible for dogs of all stages. The energy density is a little bit higher, of course, with the higher level of fat. So you're right, you just need to scale it down a little bit. And we do have extended feeding guidelines on our website now that offer that life stage for that formula, so that you can kind of gauge where you need to be. The biggest thing always being, your dogs better than we will ever know your dogs. And, you're looking at body condition, you're looking at the overall health of the animal. And if it looks healthy and it's growing healthy, you're good. You might need to adjust up or down a little bit on what you're feeding based on that. But it's completely suitable.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I've had good luck on it. And while we're talking about the energy levels, I want you to dive into that just a little bit. That make sure everybody understands that dogs get their energy level from the fat content.
Right.
And not like the protein. I mean, I'm not saying protein's not important, not at all. But I'm just saying I think a lot of people don't look at the fat content on, and especially for us. I mean, we've been running. I mean, I've been running since August. August, September. I did have a little downtime in October, but I did make a couple trips down east and hunted. And in November, I was down in North Carolina hunting. And then, of course, our season's in full swing right now, and my dogs are pretty much going 5 and 6 days a week. So, that I need that. Like, I need that, and I can see how it benefits my dogs over some of the other guys that are not feeding. They're not even feeding quality food. I won't say who, but they're not even feeding quality food. I mean, if they were feeding a good quality food, then I feel like it would be different. But nobody is feeding the fat content other than me.
Right. So there's 3 nutrients in the food that can provide calories to the dog. The first one is the protein. Now, the thing about protein is that it's so universally used in everything else that the dog needs to do. Like the body of the dog needs that protein to rebuild muscles after it's been running, right? It needs that protein to grow when it's a puppy. It needs that protein for all enzymatic reactions, and basically everything that happens in the dog's body involves some level of protein. So the protein in the diet, the best use for that, even though it can be used for energy, is general maintenance and recovery. Okay. The next one is fat. So fat itself has twice the amount of calories in it than what your protein or what your carbohydrates would have. Those are your three. Your protein that you want to be used for body maintenance. You've got your fat, and you've got your carbohydrates. And fat has twice the number of calories as the other two. Now, the fat itself, what makes dogs a little bit different than humans is that if we're going to go and exercise, or we've kind of all have it ingrained, if you played any sort of sport, to go and carb load, right? Like you have your big meal of pasta. Sometimes several days ahead, you kind of load up. And what that does is it gives you lots of glucose, which your body stores as glycogen. And that glycogen and glucose, those are kind of what our bodies will use to supply energy over time. And when you start to reduce your glycogen stores, you start to get fatigued and more into the area where you're more prone to injury. And that's how it works in humans. When it comes to dogs will use they still operate off of glucose. We get our glucose and glycogen from carbohydrates. Dogs can use that to a certain extent. Dogs will use primarily carbohydrates to fuel that activity because it's in short duration, and that energy source is readily available. As soon as you get into any sort of activity that is prolonged, when we're even talking, more than half an hour and onwards, dogs have the ability to use fats directly. So they will take free fatty acids from their bloodstream and turn that directly into energy and go with it and use that as their primary energy source, where humans, we can't do that. And really very few other animals can. So the thing about fat is that not only does it contain more energy, it also makes it so that you can get that energy into that dog in a lesser amount of volume. It's there's more calories. The density of calories is greater, so you can feed less and still get more energy into your dog than you can with other types of food or other types of nutrients that may also provide energy, just but not at the same concentration. So I guess our whole focus with this line of food from the get-go was, we've got these sled dogs that are running the Iditarod. We feed quite a few of those teams, and they need as much energy as they can get into themselves in the smallest amount of volume because they're running. But there's also instances where, heat is an issue. If it's too hot outside and dogs don't like to eat, but yet they're burning more energy because they need to cool off their bodies, getting more into that animal in a lesser volume is also an advantage.
Yeah, I've noticed.
That kind of.
Yes, no, I have a dog that you just described him to a T when it's hot. He is very finicky, and it worries me because sometimes he'll pick, and when I say pick, I mean he'll pick. He don't eat much at all when it's hot and he's running, but I have seen that that he's not dropping off either. He still maintains a very good weight. Of course, now the weather's different. It's warmer. It's hot, actually. It's not warm. It's hot. But yeah, I can actually see exactly what you're saying with what you just said. So you talked about calories per. Is there anything you want to add before we move on?
Oh no! I was just going to say, I have two border collies. We're weekend warriors, but I run into that issue where they don't want to eat in the summertime, and I bump them up into sometimes 32 because it's the only way you can get enough fuel in them to keep weight. So apply that concept to working dogs, and it gets to be a larger and a more appropriate thing. Yep. I mean, like I said, if you pay attention to your dogs, you're going to see those things. You're going to see it a lot. Like I said, I've got 13 different dogs out here, and every one of them's individually different. Like this one likes this, this one does this. I've got 2, 3 that's on the same lines, but I got one that would eat if he had to lay down and eat.
Like, it don't matter. He's eating. But so, this is where I want to get into the caloric cup. And I just want to add a little bit of like information so people maybe they'll grasp it. The numbers, it didn't. I adjust my food accordingly, and I can look at my dogs and I know add a little bit, take away, just like you said. But even with me being able to do that, after I got to looking at these numbers that we're going to talk about in just a minute, I was still underfeeding my dog. My dog still looked good, but I think this is going to bring a light to a lot of people. So I'm assuming that every bag of dog food has calories per cup, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
And let's talk about kilocup and caloric cup. That way that we just get that over and done with. The kilocup is
So you're talking kilocalories, right?
Yeah, kilocalorie. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is one of those things that you'll see this in the human marketplace as well, where you'll see things written out as kcals, which is kilocalories, which is, for all intents and purposes, is the same thing as a calorie. So a kilocalorie is actually 1,000 calories. However, universally, both in human food and dog food, we operate in kilocalories, but we call them calories. This is just a naming thing.
Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. I mean, that way people aren't asking. I've been asked that a lot. I'm like, I don't know. It's just a cup. It's just a calorie.
One of those silly.
Yeah.
It's one of those silly things.
So I'm going to put some numbers out here, and you correct me. This is your dog food, but so the 32-32, we're running about 720 calories per cup.
Yes.
Okay. 30-25, we're running 578.
Yes.
And then if you use the Marine 25, I'm actually gaining. It's 580.
Yeah, pretty close, though.
Yep.
Pretty close to the same. Yep.
Okay, so this is where I really got interested in this. I was reading an article from the American Canine Health Foundation, and it was talking about dogs in general, and it was talking about, it did bring up the sled dogs, and it was talking about how many calories they burn per day, and it said they could burn anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 calories on their runs. So I got to looking at that, and I'm like, well, wait a second, 8,000 to 12,000 calories? So I looked up hunting dogs, and this is basically what it said. And you can go on, if anybody wants to look at this, they can go on the American Canine Health Foundation, and you can Google it. How true Google is, I don't know, but that's why I've got a professional on the other end of this podcast helping us out. But it said that for every pound your dog is, so I'm just going to use one of my dogs. Spook is 64 pounds. It says that he burns 8 calories per pound per mile. So I had to break out my calculator, and I'm like, okay, so 64 times 8 is 512 calories. And if I run him 6 miles, which is what he covered today, then he's basically burning 3,072 calories. So then I got to breaking it down per cup. Okay, so I'm feeding, Spook was getting about 3 to 3.5 cups is what I was feeding him, and I'm feeding a 30-22, so that's 720 calories per cup. That's what I was feeding him. So I'm like, wait a second. When I done the math, I was coming up about 500 to 700 calories short. So here it is, winter. The dogs are running in water. Saturday was awful. They were soaking wet. I mean, they looked like they'd swum a lake. And I'm like, okay, so he looks okay. He looks good to me by eye. But in reality, like, I'm not giving him enough calories to maintain or even replenish what he just burned.
Right.
So anyway, I had to up him to 4.5 cups, and that's the 30. That's the 32, which is a lot, because in the summertime I can feed a cup and a half of that, and a half a cup to most of my dogs, because I've got some little dogs, and they look like. I mean, they're fat.
Yeah.
So talk to us. I mean, tell us a little bit about that. What's your take on that? And I even broke it down to the 30-25. If I'm running 6 miles with some of my smaller dogs, I'm still needed to feed them 4.2 cups. So I would probably just go ahead and feed them 4.5, because it is winter time. I mean, it's getting cooler. Like I said, they are in an adverse environment. A lot of times it's wet. They're crossing creeks. It's been really the last week. It was raining pretty much every day. The dogs were soaking wet. So that kind of it really opened my eyes that even though in my mind I'm doing good, but if you break it down, and this is accurate, 8 calories per pound per mile. That's a lot of calories. How do the sled dog guys put 8 or 10,000 calories back in their dogs?
It's you gotta feed a really high fat food. It's really the only way that they can get those calories back in your dog. When it comes to running dogs, there's so many things that kind of factor into that. As you said, your dog's body condition seems to be maintaining. That's always a good thing. And if you start to see that drop off, that's something where it's a very good indicator that you should be upping your how much you're feeding your actual dog. The other indicator of how you're doing, oftentimes, especially on the higher fat diets, is your stool quality, because if you start to overfeed, you'll start to see a looser stool, and that's a pretty ready indicator that you might be not feeding or feeding too much to that particular animal. Mm-hmm. But that's the thing, Heath, you're right, there's so many things that factor into that. There's the individual dog itself and the size of that dog. There's the temperature that they're running. If it is raining or snowing or it's wet, that factors in. There's the coat of that dog. Is it a double coat or a single coat? Is it thick? Is it long? That all factors in. The intensity of the exercise, the duration of the exercise, all of that stuff factors into how much you actually need to feed that animal. And we all dog food bags, you'll see recommended feeding guidelines on there. Those guidelines are built around your average adult dog. So taking that into consideration, what the general rule is for dogs that we would be performing hunt tasks at, what they would call the thermoneutral zone, which is, more your ambient temperatures. So let's say, just part of my Canadian brain here, but I think about 60 degrees Fahrenheit to about 73, 74, somewhere in that range would be thermal neutral, mm-hmm. where it's not cold, it's not hot, they don't have to worry about their body temperature itself. In that range itself, the general rule of thumb is the dog will require about 1.5 to 2.5 times what the adult maintenance requirement of calories would be to fuel that animal in that particular climate. Now, once you get into, even if it gets down to be about 47 degrees, somewhere in that area, you're talking about probably another 25%. Increase in calories on top of that 1.5 to 2.5. So it does add up quick, and if you're not kind of paying attention to it, you very much can get into a situation where you may be underfeeding your dog, and you may not know right away, but you may see it in either performance or you might see it in weight loss over time.
Well, and I think, and I've been guilty of this, that, I start running my dogs, and I'll just use December because I want that the weather is very important now. And I'm sitting here reading from the Canine Health Foundation. I was just reading while you were talking. It's saying here that every 10 degrees drop in temperature, you should increase the dog's 7 to 7.5%. And that's after you get a baseline, which is what you were talking about. And then it said, factors in stress, travel, excitement, hunting, and other activities. So, I can see this in my dogs, and I'll just use mine for an example. It used to be that I knew when hunting season started, about the second weekend, I knew I was going to see a drop in my dog's weight. not to the position of they're starved, but a little bit thinner than I would like them to be. If you look at and even like for me, even though it's cold right now, and it was 30 some degrees this morning, I know that looking at those 3 ribs when the dog's working, that's kind of where you want them. And you can lay your finger between their tailbone, but you don't want those tailbones up. They can have a slight valley there. I like mine to be just a little bit heavier than that this time of year, because I do know that they're burning so many calories. And I think, us as hunters, we see that shock to their system, where we were feeding dog food A and we feed them 4 cups or whatever it may be. I'm just going to use 4 cups because that seems to be the norm. I feed them 4 cups and I hunt them for a week, and by the second week I'm feeding them the same, but my dog's body structure, the body makeup is changing because they're burning so many calories. And I have actually started, I've probably been doing this 5 or 6 years, but 2 weeks before, and I know all the stuff they say about, the dog food, but I don't switch dog foods. Like, I feed the same thing year round. I don't downgrade to 2616. I don't mean downgrade, but I don't drop down to 2616. Yeah. I just keep it where I'm at. But I try 2 weeks ahead of hunting season to give my dogs a little extra so I don't see that a shock in their system. And that's how I describe it, is like, I know last week when hunting season started that my dogs have kind of went from being lazy, not doing a whole lot, to, running 8, 10, 12, 15 miles. So I try to avoid that. But what you're saying, the way you're explaining it, is exactly what we're seeing. It's just in a more technical term. Yeah, absolutely.
Like, it sounds complicated, and in a lot of ways it is, but it's not something that you need to overcomplicate. It is, if do some basic math, if it's going to be colder outside, maybe add an extra handful of food, calculate your 1.5 to 2.5 times what you might feed if your dog was doing nothing, and then go from there. And if the stool quality starts to drop off or the body condition starts to change in a way that's not favorable, you adjust. Like, they're guidelines. All of these things are guidelines, but at the end of the day, your dog's best, and you got to adjust based on user and what the dog needs, and that's a hard thing for us to tell because there are so many things that actually factor into that.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm just kind of skimming through this, but it was kind of interesting about, just the weather alone. And we all know it. We all know when winter comes that, the dogs are burning twice the amount of calories trying to keep heat and keep themselves warm, and everything. So, you're just to factor that in, and then you're putting this extreme sport that we're doing on top of it. Like, it's kind of like a double whammy. So, anything else on like the endurance or the performance side of things that you can add to us or help us or give us some knowledge about?
It depends on what you're looking to know. If you're digging into the research, what you find on the internet too deeply, one of the things that I always find to be a little bit confusing is that if you start reading papers and they start talking about, things like your percentage of calories from your protein, your fat, and your carbohydrates, and that doesn't exactly translate into the percentages that are on your dog food bags. There's a few things and tricks and whatnot I can send you after that. I don't know if you put a post up alongside things that can kind of help alleviate some of that confusion, because given that there's more energy in fat than there is in carbohydrates and protein, sometimes you'll see that sled dogs should get 60% of their energy from fats, and that does not translate directly to, what you would see in the store shelf. So, there's tips and tricks, and I'm sure there's online calculators too to kind of help make those conversions when it comes to working dogs, because that's how science works, is in the calories from the different nutrients. Whereas, you look at crude protein and it's not the same thing. Yeah, and there's a few basic things that I can send along, and I don't know if you guys are interested in that information.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll add it to the show notes where people can go on it and click and look at it, and definitely. I mean, anything that like I said, when I started reading this, it it really shined a light on more. I don't even know the word to use. I don't want to say maybe the scientific. It was a more scientific explanation of what was going on within my dogs that I didn't know internally. It was what I was seeing externally as far as their body makeup, and it opened my eyes. And like I said, I'm assuming that this is a reputable site. It's got a lot of information on it. I mean, I didn't see that it was a peer reviewed or anything. But it has a lot of educational stuff on it. But yeah, it really, like I said, and like I said, I feel like I feed my dogs really well. Like, I feel like my dogs look healthy. They maintain a good, healthy weight. And then I'm reading that 8 calories per pound per mile, and I'm like, man, I'm underfeeding my dogs. Like, yeah, I may run 10 miles 2 days in a row, and then I don't run a mile, or I may get really lucky and go 300 yards in tree. So those days are actually making up for the 10 miles that I've underfed.
Yeah, it's a lot of averages in the end, right? Like, if your dog's running all the time and you're constantly underfeeding, then you'll eventually see that your dogs are starting to thin out. But if it's less frequent and you're maintaining weight, you're in a better spot.
Well, and the dog's just going to perform better.
Right.
Yeah. He's got the energy to do it.
There's a couple other things too, that when we're formulating diets, what we try to do, and that in terms of performance, probably are helpful. Our diets or other people's diets, it doesn't really matter. But like, you want, when it comes to performance animals, you want your essential proteins, your essential amino acids, the building blocks of proteins that the dog must get from the diet, to come from animal sources. It's more digestible. They can get more out of it. So, we always formulate our foods with more than one animal protein in them. Mm-hmm. And that's a good rule of thumb and a good thing to follow if you're looking for a performance food. Same thing with fats. So, a range of fats, there's essential fatty acids as well that the dog needs. And we try to get those in from a variety of different fats as well, and that kind of just, it helps with olfactory as well. If they're unsaturated fats, those fats that are liquid at room temperature, things like fish oil, chicken fats as well. But if you can get a range of ingredients as opposed to just one protein, one fat source, the dog can get more out of that food from those natural animal sources, which is you can see benefits of that. There's science research backs that up in performance animals. So those type of things would be what I would recommend. But at the end of the day, as we've been talking about, feeding guidelines are just guidelines, so don't adhere strictly to those. Your dogs, monitor their weight. If they need a little bit more, they need a little more. If they need a little bit less, they need a little bit less. And if food doesn't work for them, it doesn't work for them. That happens sometimes too. They are individuals.
Yes, and every I think. Don't get me into the vets. We have a vet that hunts with us, and me and him go through this all the time about putting them on the sensitive this and diet. And me and him kind of go back and forth with it. But you just said something there that caught my attention. You said the fat affects the olfactory. Right. Can you care to explain that a little bit?
So there's more and more research out there that suggests, at least in laboratory settings, that feeding what they call polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFA is the abbreviation, how you'll typically see it written out. But what those are those fats that are really liquid at room temperature. So you'll get, but in terms of vegetable ones, it's like your canolas and your sunflower and your olive oils, things like that, corn oil even. From animal sources, your chicken fats, your fish oils, stuff like that. Those are all polyunsaturated fatty acids. Those are, they're still working on this, but the ingestion of those, they're finding to help with detection and olfaction in dogs that perform those tasks, so hunting and both the canine world as well. And what they think happens is that those fluid fats help with the fluidity of the membrane that's in the back of the dog's nose, which helps with the connection from the nose to the brain and helps with detection, especially in minute amounts. So there's more and more research into that kind of stuff right now. Versus if you were feeding a food that had more of your fats that are solid at room temperature, so your lards and your coconut, things like that.
So interesting. So it's basically keeping that part of the olfactory system in the dog's nose more lubricated, is what you're saying.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, and it's so far this study has said that they're able to pick up a lesser trace of the odor.
Yeah.
Less of
at least in laboratory settings, yeah. And there's been a few studies done on it in a variety of different species, and it seems, breeds, it seems to hold true. The exact reasoning is still a little fuzzy, but the thought is that it increases that connection in between the nose and the brain.
Wow. Well, if it works, I need colder nosed dogs. So if it works, I'm willing to give it a try.
Yeah.
Emily, is there anything else on the nutrition side? I mean, I know that's what you do. Any tips, any tricks, any just stuff that we should know or pay attention to help our dogs perform better?
I mean, at the end of the day, it all comes down to what works for you and your dog. We're big proponents here that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So if what you're feeding works and you're getting the performance that you want out of your animal, you don't need to change it. If you're looking to change things up, there are lots of options out there, ours and others. But really, at the end of the day, you know your dog better than we will ever know your dog. So you got to trust your guide on a lot of things. Yeah.
And I think, especially with, the economy, the way it is, prices are hard. Especially, people tell me all the time, I don't know how you feed 13 dogs. And, well, I've gotten myself into a place where I budget for it. And, it's just, I'm learning that feeding a good quality food, whatever it may be, is less expensive in the long run.
Right.
It may cost you up front, or you may think that because I'm paying X amount of dollars for a bag of food that it's too expensive. But it's just what you're saying, that if I have to feed less of it and I get the same or better performance, that's huge. And I have found that. I mean, now in the season, like during season, when I'm running my dogs hard, I go through a little bit more food because I'm stoking the fire. I'm putting the fuel in them. I want them to perform. I expect the extreme performance out of them, and I know that I go through a little bit more food. But in the off season, I'm feeding half of what most of the guys that I run with feed. Right. I mean, I'm two cups is a lot. Most, especially in the summertime. Compared to
those bags last you a lot longer that way.
Yeah, I mean, even though the bag, I think y'all's I'm feeding 33. Yeah, 33 for the 30-25, and then 44 for the 32-32. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm feeding, I'm feeding quite a bit right now with a 32, but I'm like I said, I'm adding more to keep the dogs where they need to be, so I can run them every day. And like I said, I see that. And one thing that we talked about before we got on here is when I went to you guys' website, I realized that you actually have a calculator built in.
Yeah, we put a calculator in. Yep.
Yeah, and that's not for performance. That's just for regulating. My dog weighs 60 pounds. Well, let me just do it here. I got it pulled up. Let me do it and see what it says. The feeding calculator. It says, use the calculator below to estimate how much you should feed your dog per day. And y'all have on here, every dog is different. The calculator only provides estimate based on average weights of dogs and average activity levels. So we would add to it. So I'm going to put my 64-pound dog, and it says, "Oop, what happened there? Why did it do that?" And it went back to...
Did it glitch on you?
It must have. When I coughed, I think I hit it. Here, let's do it again. So 60. So I'm going to go to 64 pounds. It says 1,401 calories per day, and then it asks me what formulas that I would want to feed. Of course, I'm going to put 32 in, and it says, "Is your dog?" My dog's extremely active or overweight or underweight. I am experiencing canine professional. And then I go ahead and click on it, and then it says basically I would feed 1.9 cups, which is less than 2 cups per day. So one bag of 32 should last me 64 days.
Yeah.
So that's 9.5, that's 9.2 weeks. That's,
yep.
That's over 2 months. So.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is it requires a little bit of math, but we put those up there because we did a little bit of e-com we do a little bit of e-com off our website, but it helps those people figure out when they need to reorder, but the tool itself is universally applicable of just kind of to calculate your cost savings, but really how long that bag will last you, under, non-performance conditions, but you adjust up or down from there based on your requirements.
Yeah, and it even says it would cost you $1.45 per day is what it's costing you to feed that dog. So I thought that was pretty neat. Like I said, I'm feeding 4.5 cups right now, but that's because of the calories I'm burning. 4 cups to 4.5, it depends. But I'm trying to make sure my dog's getting 3,000 calories a day for what I'm doing right now. So like I said, I am feeding more at this point, but come middle of January, I will not be. I'll be back down to feeding 2 cups a day because that's what I need. That's what I feed him when I'm not running him. So this is it's very accurate because I was doing it without even knowing it.
Yeah.
So.
The other thing too, I guess we can point out while we're talking about this, is if you have a larger dog and you have bloat concerns, feeding a lesser volume can help with that. It doesn't necessarily reduce the genetic risk, but you're putting less volume into that animal, so it's sometimes a beneficial thing to do.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to bring up before we finish this, I have noticed that when Inukshook gets wet, it does not expand. Can you elaborate on that? Yeah.
So the way that we get our fats into our kibble is a little bit different than how most pet food companies do it. So given that the industry that we come from is feeding fish, you have to think about how oils and waters separate. So the way that we do things is, and have always done things, and we've just taken this technology that we had for our old industry and applied it to the new one, is that we vacuum infuse our kibble. So we make our kibble, it gets cooked, it gets dried, it goes into a vacuum infusion chamber. We slowly suck all the air out and then let it back in. And what that does is it takes the fats that have been coated on the outside and pulls them into all of the little pores that are in the kibble. So what that does is it increases the density.
Mm-hmm.
It puts those fats to the inside, so there's less oxidation, there's less oxygen exposed, but it makes the kibble itself really, really firm and really dense. And the reason it doesn't absorb water is that all of that energy is now in all of those spaces, so it sinks because it's heavier than water, but it also takes a lot longer to absorb that water because there's no place for that water to actually enter into that kibble. And so for you, what that means is that energy is getting into your dog. It's not just sitting on the outside of the kibble. It's not on the inside of the bag. It's not exposed to oxygen, so it doesn't oxidate as much, which is what you want. But it gives you that nice, clean, crisp, high energy, high density kibble that's kind of our characteristic and signature look.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, and it is. There's not a greasy feel to it. The bag's not greasy. But yeah, I just wanted to touch on that because I thought the first time I ever noticed that, I'm like, what? But then I'd watched the videos and I understood the infusion and how that worked. Yeah. But yeah, it was pretty cool. So no, it's neat, and it is what allows us to get that 32% fat in there. Industry standard, you might find some that are 25% out there, but most of them are even going to be a little bit greasy to touch because they don't use vacuum infusion. They coat on the outside and shake things around a little bit. But yeah, having that infusion technology really does allow us to get that energy into your animal. Yeah, well, I need it. I need it for this. I need it for December anyway.
Yeah.
Well, Emily, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to talk to us about the nutrition and the things that you've taught us today. Like I said, I appreciate it. I think the listeners will get something out, especially when they start looking at the calories their dogs are burning, and go to their dog food bag and find out how many calories per cup they're feeding, and hopefully they can adjust if they're not doing it already. Like I said, most hounds and most dog people, they keep a pretty good eye on their dogs anyway, and they notice if something's off. So, like I said, I appreciate it. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you coming on here and talking to us. Is there anything you want to leave us with?
If there's any questions, we're here to help. This is what we do day in and day out. So reach out to us. Our website is Inukshookpro.com, and we've got lots of people here to talk. If you have any other questions about really anything animal nutrition related, that's what we're here to do. So really appreciate your time, Heath.
No, thank you. And like we end every podcast, thank you for helping us teach, train, and definitely learn about nutrition.